Supposedly, China is looking at how we interact with Ukraine and whether or not we continue aid for their war with Russia, and using that as a determining factor as to whether or not they will be able to pull off an invasion of Taiwan. I think it's the wrong move. I don't know that one necessarily has a direct impact on the other, but there's a good article in the Wall Street Journal that just came out diving right into that. It's titled, "The Taiwanese are worried that the U.S. will abandon Ukraine." Now, before getting into it, I want to say the author of the article, Seth Jones, works for the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. It's an American think tank that has, since the start of the war, been heavily advocating for more and more advanced weaponry to Ukraine. So that's, I feel like you got to know that getting into this article, because it is going to have some shades of, kind of offhand suggesting that we have to do more for Ukraine, if that makes sense. It's not all about Taiwan, as the title might make you believe. He says that American allies in Asia are increasingly concerned about stalling aid to Ukraine. These worries are particularly acute in Taiwan, where leaders told me this month that a major decline in U.S. military assistance to Kyiv would embolden Beijing and weaken deterrence in Asia, which is like a catch-22 when you hear some of the arguments about why we need to stop supporting Ukraine, right? And one of the major arguments is we can't afford to focus this much energy on Ukraine because it takes away from our ability to counter China in the Pacific. But at the same time, now they're saying, well, if you stop doing that, then that'll show China that they can do whatever they want with Taiwan because we don't have the staying power or the backbone, whatever it is. So, there's no good situation, apparently. Now, full disclosure, I tend to be in the camp that we can do two things at once. And this article is actually going to hit on some of the reasons why I feel that way. They say opposition to supporting Ukraine is building among some members of Congress who argue that America should concentrate exclusively on China and the defense of Taiwan. These officials contend that our resources are finite, that weapons exports to Ukraine come at Taiwan's expense, and that sustained focus on war in Europe benefits China. I want to hit on that last piece real quick. I think it is a stretch to say that sustained war in Europe benefits China. I do think China has benefited economically in some senses, but Russia and China are pretty significant allies. And I think if China had the option for the war to have ended yesterday, they'd check that box. It reminds me of, there was some commentary about World War I, and Germany kept choosing these allies and had these allies that couldn't pull their own weight. And there was a saying somewhere in a podcast or a book I read talking about how Germany kept tethering themselves to a corpse. So they had an ally, but the ally was just dragging them down. Now, that wasn't the reason that Germany lost the First World War, but it didn't help, right? And that's kind of how I view the current Chinese-Russian relationship. The Russian military is degraded, somewhat degraded, right? More degraded now than they were 2 years ago. They're occupied. They're heavily vested in Ukraine. So if China were to need the Russian military in any capacity, they're not going to get 100% of Russia's resources. Just how it is. So in my mind, it's hard to look at this and see that China sees the war as a positive. Like it's really distracting much of anything. The counter to that would be that it has too much of our attention or anyone's attention that would also be interested in how politics and geopolitics play out in Asia. I don't know that we have moved any resources, right, from the Pacific to Europe for this war. If anything, our footprint has kind of increased in that area over the last few years, right? I mean, we do have troops going to Eastern Europe, but we also have troops stationed all across the Pacific and doing training exercises with our partners there. So, it's not as though that stuff stopped. If anything, it's kind of ramped up. Now, they say a declining percentage of the island's population, Taiwan's, believe the U.S. would send troops in case of war. One poll conducted by the Taiwanese Public Opinion Foundation found that only 30% of Taiwanese believed Americans would do that. So only 36% of Taiwanese believe that Americans would show up if they were invaded by China. I'd be interested to see what that stat looked like over time. Is that like half? Was it 80% before the war in Ukraine? Or was it 33%? And this isn't much of a change at all. I'd also be interested in what the U.S. percentage is for that same question. 36 seems high, if I'm being honest. I don't know that there's any country in the world right now that Americans are just chomping at the bit to go to war with, right? Like if we ran a poll in the United States and said, how many of you would want to go to war with China if they invaded Taiwan? I feel like I feel like most would answer no. I think yes would be less than 36%. Gut feeling, maybe I'd be wrong. This seems like something that we'd have to be sold on a little bit, if that makes sense, right? Continuing on, they say his administration's policies, talking about President Biden, have failed to reassure Taiwan. In 2021, the U.S. withdrew its military forces from Afghanistan, leading to the quick collapse of the Afghan government and Taliban victory. A year later, President Biden ruled out sending U.S. troops to Ukraine, raising anxieties in Taiwan. Nah, I disagree. I'm not on board with this piece here. Just, look, the situation in Afghanistan is so drastically different than what's going on in Ukraine or what could potentially happen between China and Russia, right? Those are major geopolitical moves, and that just was not the case in Afghanistan. It just wasn't. And the withdrawal was a mess, 100%. I don't think anybody says otherwise, but it also could have happened 4 years prior or 8 years prior or 6 months prior, right? Like the problem in Afghanistan, the withdrawal was not good, but the problem was we weren't really accomplishing much of anything at all, if we're being honest, after like 2003, maybe. Look, I was there in 2010. I wish I could point to that and say that was a major turning point in their country's history, but it just wasn't. From the time I was there in 2010, then again in 2012, and it looked the same. They still couldn't stand up to the Taliban. So like, when should we have left? Before that? So anyways, I don't know that Afghanistan is a good case study for Taiwan to look at. And then the argument that not sending U.S. troops to Ukraine raises anxieties in Taiwan. Like, what? No. There has been so little support in the United States to actually put troops on the ground in Ukraine. It's never really been on the table. The idea that someone would look at that and say, oh, the United States does not support their allies, I think that's a bit of an extreme view, if I'm being honest. I don't think very many people look at the U.S. not committing troops to an active war with Russia as a sign of weakness. I think it's a bad take in the article. They say over the past several months, Beijing's military has ramped up pressure around Taiwan. China's Air Force now routinely flies into Taiwan's air defense zone and sends fighter aircraft across the Taiwan Strait's median line, which has served as an unofficial barrier. This has really ramped up over the last couple months. It was just earlier this week, I think it was 103 aircraft in one day. So this is not like one aircraft just happens to come near the median line. It is so many aircraft and so many ships that there are a lot of analysts saying that it's not just kind of towing the line, it's actively preparing and doing practice runs in the event of an invasion. And one of the challenges here is the more that happens, the more it just kind of tires out the early warning systems, right? You get used to China just running these operations through the strait, and it's, it was one aircraft, then it was a dozen, and now it's 103, right? One day they might blink and make a 90-degree turn, and all of a sudden the war is on. And it's hard to always be on your toes when you have to always be on your toes, kind of thing. The author continues here in these last few points I agree with him on, so we'll end on a good note. He says, it's a false dichotomy to argue that the U.S. needs to choose between China and Russia. Both are authoritarian regimes cooperating on two major axes. Yes, we can do two things at once. We are capable of doing two things at once. Until shown otherwise, I think we can do that, and I think we should plan to do that. That's just a place that the United States is in the world right now. Wrapping up, he says, these fronts, talking about Europe and the Pacific, require different weapons packages, training programs, and defense postures for very different wars. The Indo-Pacific is mostly an air-sea battle, while Europe is primarily an air-land battle. That is something that gets glossed over so much when we're talking about, focusing on Ukraine or sending aid to Ukraine means that we can't do something for Taiwan. Like, yes, there are packages of munitions that could go to Taiwan, but instead are going to Ukraine. But big picture, it's a naval and air war that's going to happen if the United States gets involved with Taiwan and China. And that is just we're not really sending any naval resources, and there's limited air resources being dedicated to the war in Ukraine. And when I say air resources, not even like the F-16s that partners have given to Ukraine or have pledged to Ukraine, but some of the intelligence aircraft flying over NATO countries. I don't know if that number is like jacked up, significantly since the start of the war, but we have a substantial footprint in the Pacific, right? It's not like we've stripped that down entirely and it's all gone over to Ukraine, right? I think we still, as it sits today, have a pretty substantial posture in the Pacific to deal with anything if China decides to kick this off. But that's all I got for now. Again, I'll link the article in the description below, along with a link to Substack, where I put out national security sit reps once a week, 7 to 10 of the top national security stories, along with a few podcast recommendations if they're out there. But that is all I've got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.